Well, joining me today looking through those are the Times columnist Melanie Phillips and the editor of politics.co.uk, Ian Dunt. Nice to see you both. And Melanie, sort of two columns from the Daily Mail and the Financial Times, both suggesting that sleaze is a problem, but rather differing on what the long-term consequences are likely to be.
Yes, I was very struck by Robert Shrimsley's analysis in the Financial Times, which I think made some extremely good points. In my view, and I think this is what he's saying as well, and so is Stephen Glover, the most serious accusation is not to do with James Dyson and his ventilators and so on. It's to do with the cronyism charge centred around David Cameron. And what strikes me about that is that, as Robert Shrimsley says, the Prime Minister is unlikely to get to grips with this, not because of his character, so much as the fact that, as he points out, there is now a view that's fairly entrenched in the government, which says that, as he puts it, the kind of buccaneers of the private sector are to be preferred to civil servants. Now, what he doesn't say, well, which I've noted, is that the most disturbing thing to me, going beyond David Cameron's highly questionable activities in recommending the activities of or the services of the Greensill company that he worked for, was this apparently Cabinet Office sanctioned permission for civil servants to work for private companies like Greensill simultaneously with being civil servants. Now, this goes back far beyond David Cameron. I would say it goes back to Mrs. Thatcher, who believed that the civil service was a kind of conspiracy against her reformist agenda. And she set the pattern for what we have now seen develop at pace over the years, which is the preference given to the public sector. And while that has certain advantage, to the private sector, to private buccaneers coming in to do what civil servants previously did, and while that has certainly had some major advantages, it has created this kind of revolving door situation in which the boundary between publicly funded officials and private commercial interests has been, in my view, dangerously blurred.
Keir Starmer, as quoted in his columns, used the triple sleaze in Prime Minister's questions yesterday. Is he right to do that, and will it be effective?
I mean, he's doing it because he thinks it will be effective. And I think kind of you can get the hint if you look at the way that the Tories have responded, that Johnson has responded, and that Labour has responded, that they both recognise this has the capacity to damage the government. I mean, Boris Johnson is not someone who comes forward very quickly unless he thinks that there's political calculations to be made. You have 5 days of violence in Northern Ireland before he says anything at all. You have an hour of a story on the Football Super League before he comes out both guns blazing. In this case, on lobbying, on sleaze, he came out hard and really quite fast. Many, many inquiries going on. And you see the same from Starmer. That's probably because they're both listening to focus groups that are starting to bring this up without anybody asking them about it. They know that if you get that drip feed of punishment against the Tories on sleaze stories, eventually it just takes one big primary coloured story, a kind of Dominic Cummings type story that will just detonate the whole thing. So, yeah, I mean, he's doing it because he thinks it's going to work, and there's a good chance that it will.
Now, a very sobering column by David Aronovich in the Times, focusing on the United States and the death of George Floyd and the conviction of Derek Chauvin. And he's basically saying, Melanie, look, you know, we've got to face up to it. This is a sick and violent society in America, and this sort of thing is likely to go on happening.
Yes, well, I think he makes some very good points. I mean, it seems to me, and I'm sure I'm not alone, that America is a very violent society. It believes in the power of the gun to safeguard individual freedom, and the police are correspondingly violent. And I'm sure that Aronovich is right to identify a culture in violence in the American police. Where I think he's wrong, however, is to link this with race specifically, and to say that what we are seeing is a racist violence in the police, in the American police. The fact is that notwithstanding the appalling events of the murder of George Floyd, the vast majority of black people in America who are murdered by other black people, and the vast majority of people who are killed by the police in violent encounters are white. And there is something like 18 times the rate at which the police are murdered by black people is something like 18 times that's 18 times. The police officer in America is more than 18 times more likely to be killed by a black male than a black male is by a police officer. So I think there's a lot of myths going around here. There is undoubtedly racism in America. There is undoubtedly, as David Aronovich says, a history of slavery and racism, which is very recent and very raw and has not been dealt with properly, has not been faced up to properly. And I believe that it has produced a kind of corresponding reaction in the other direction, which is far too extreme.
Of course, that statistic may just be about the number of police and the number of African Americans there are in society. But in Dunt, what do you think? Do you think that how important an element in this problem in America do you think race is?
It's absolutely pivotal. And I think you really have to maintain an extremely blinkered view to not see the manner in which the police repeatedly treat black people in the States. And also, let's talk about over here, Latin Americans as well and Asians. But I mean, predominantly, black people get it harder than anyone else in the States. Look at the bill that is currently being under threat of filibuster by the Republicans. This is a bill that is asking for the police to undergo bias training to evaluate whether there is bias in the police, to eradicate the use of certain chokeholds, and to make the fatal responses by the police, essentially the kind of response that can kill someone, is a last resort. It seems extraordinary that you would ever need a piece of legislation to tell the police that you would try de-escalation first and then resort to fatal methods. And yet that in itself is considered controversial enough that it is being filibustered by Republicans. That speaks to something properly toxic and broken in a political system and in a policing system. If there's any luck in the world, it's the moment they'll start dealing with it now.
OK, Melanie, just finally, I think you're in Israel. They've had a very good vaccine, as in the UK in Israel, but things have opened up rather more than they have here. Isn't that right?
Yes, but the point is that something like 80% of all vaccinatable people have been vaccinated, or 80% of the population have been vaccinated. Virtually everybody who's vaccinatable has been vaccinated. And this is the point that speaks to the controversy in Britain, where Boris Johnson is being pilloried for saying let's still be cautious, and playing down apparently playing down the good effects of the vaccine in bringing down the figures in Britain, and saying instead it's mainly the lockdown that's done the heavy lifting here, and people are incredulous. But it seems to me quite obvious. Not enough people in Britain have yet been vaccinated. I've forgotten the figure. It's something like half the population has now had one vaccination. We only have one, and that still leaves a very large number of people who haven't been vaccinated. In Israel, when the vaccination program was already going, gangbusters, people were being vaccinated at a rate which was causing the world to say, my goodness, this is amazing. Israel then went into lockdown because there were still not enough people who were vaccinated. And then it got hit by the so-called Kent variant, which was fantastically infectious. And its hospitals started to get overrun and overwhelmed by younger people coming in desperately ill. That's what Boris Johnson, I believe, has in mind. Not enough people in Britain are yet vaccinated. The key to this is to vaccinate, I'm afraid, a very, very much greater proportion of the population before it can be considered safe to come out from behind the sofa.
Thank you very much. Thanks to you both. And of course, Michael Gove, the Cabinet Minister, was on a fact-finding trip to Israel to do with COVID this week, I believe.